At the tip of a long, narrow spit of sand called the Palisados, guarding the mouth of what is now Kingston Harbour in southeastern Jamaica, sits a small, quiet village, and some ruins. What a wayward eye from a cruise ship or a plane taking off from a nearby airport might not realise though is that this is Port Royal. Yes, that Port Royal. The one where Captain Jack Sparrow got the Black Pearl back. The setting for so many of this channel's younger audience's first taste of the history of life under canvas. It was, for a time, one of the wealthiest and most notorious ports in the Western Hemisphere, and yet now it's largely nondescript, a small town overshadowed by the much larger city of Kingston to the north. Port Royal today, though, is truly special. It is in many ways a modern-day Pompeii that has allowed us to understand how our ancestors lived, how they rebelled, and it opens the door to us on one of the most romanticised periods of history that is so often completely misrepresented by Hollywood and the media. Today, we are going to be talking about it in depth, and why it is special, and what happened there. And yes, for those wondering, I've been playing a lot of Black Flag over the last 2 weeks, and yes, this did influence the video quite heavily. So remember to like, hype, comment, and subscribe, and let's get into it. Long before any Europeans arrived, this spit of land was inhabited by the local Taino, an indigenous group of people who had lived across the Caribbean for centuries. They called the area Caguay or Caguaya, and it appears to have been primarily used as a fishing ground rather than a permanent settlement. It's likely they knew why this was a poor place to build upon from lived experiences, but that is something highly speculatory, and something we'll get into later, of course, in this video about why you shouldn't build there. Of course, this all changed with the arrival of Europeans, and none other than Christopher Columbus himself would make landfall on the island of Jamaica in 1494. Jamaica, unlike Cuba or Hispaniola, would not though be colonised as quickly by the Spanish, at least comparatively speaking. It would take until 1509 when Juan de Escobar would turn his attention towards Jamaica, and he took a group of Spanish settlers to the island in search of silver or gold. Jamaica though was quite resource poor in these precious metals, but the land itself was extremely fertile, which led to the island becoming a hub of plantations. But in these early days, the specific spot chosen by the Spanish, of course, would become Port Royal. And while not particularly special, it was defensible from landward attack, having only one approach and also access to an immense natural harbour. Even still, the Spanish initially did not develop it as a major settlement. Interestingly though, in this early stage, they did retain its indigenous name. With the lack of precious metals, the purpose of the settlement wasn't really to make money. Rather, it was an anti-English barrier, just to keep the rival Europeans out of Jamaica, and to defend the trade routes back to Spain from the southern Caribbean and Panama. This sort of remained a large status quo, where Spain technically controlled the island even though they didn't really put much effort into it. That is, of course, until England arrived in 1655. England, highly militarised after its civil war at home, unleashed its forces on the Caribbean in the 1650s, with Jamaica being part of a broader campaign against Spanish holdings in the Caribbean. The invasion of 1655 handed the English a Spanish colony that had been chronically underdeveloped, but geographically it was, if not physically, it was a gold mine. From this little island, the English could effectively control the trade between Spain's colonies and the Spanish homeland. In short, Jamaica was worth its weight in gold to the English, who would in time rename the settlement that they found on that little peninsula to Port Royal. Just 4 years after the capture of Port Royal by the English, 200 houses, shops and warehouses had already sprung up clustered around the original fort, and by 1692, we will get into why that date's important shortly, the settlement would be defended by 5 separate forts. 5. These required extensive works and shipping of materials from Europe, so it gives you an idea about just how important this town was for England. For much of the period between the conquest and, well, the impending doom, Port Royal would function as Jamaica's de facto capital, even though Spanish Town remained the official capital. Kingston, the island's premier city today and future capital, would not be formally designated the island's capital until 1872, and this is long after Port Royal's golden age had ended. But how did this town grow so fast and get rich so quickly? Well, the answer is crime. It's genuinely just crime. Or well, state-sanctioned crime. See, England deliberately built this town into a base for privateers. Now for those who don't know, a privateer is like a pirate, except they get a letter from one king to be a pirate for him. For example, Francis Drake was to the Spanish a pirate, but he was employed by the English crown to be a pirate in the name of England. Essentially, you get a letter of marque, you don't attack the ships of your nation, and you attack others and you get to keep the booty. It's really a get-rich-quick scheme during this period, and quite often the taste of the life would lead privateers to piracy, which quite often would end at the noose. Privateers, though, became really popular during this early modern period for England, who lacked the naval strength to confront the Spanish head-on. English, later British, naval superiority during this period is not something that should be just assumed. Right up until the late 1700s, France, Spain, and the Netherlands could and would go toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy and quite often triumph. The Netherlands especially were quite good at it. Because of this, England needed to keep most of its major ships at home, and so privateering offered a way to strike at Spanish shipping and settlements without committing to open war and sailing the battle fleet away from the home island. Governor Edward d'Oli embraced this logic, and in 1657 he saw a solution to Port Royal's need for defences when he invited brethren of the coast to make the town their home port. This loose confederation of pirates had its roots among the buccaneers, or hunters of wild cattle and pigs on Hispaniola, and this is where we get the word buccaneer in English. And these men, they had turned to piracy after being driven off the island of Hispaniola and robbed by the Spanish. So naturally, the buccaneers hated the Spanish, and they were absolutely ready to go to hell to make them pay and, make a quick buck along the way. Jamaica's governor formalised this relationship by issuing letters of marque to privateer crews, authorising them to prey on Spanish shipping, and at first, the arrangement worked remarkably well, especially as a defensive strategy. See, Spanish forces in the New World were constantly occupied defending their own possessions and shipping lanes, while the bulk of the Spanish fleet, like the English fleet, had to remain in Europe, meaning that the resources of the colonies were few and far between, and this solidified English control over Jamaica and the surrounding smaller islands. Port Royal's geography played a big part here because, like I mentioned before, it sat near the shipping lanes running to and from Spain and Panama, and this gave privateers easy access to targets. Meanwhile, its harbour was deep and spacious enough to shelter large numbers of ships, while its shallow surrounding waters were perfect for careening and other ship maintenance procedures. From this base, some of the era's most notorious captains would etch their names into history, people like Christopher Mings, who sacked Campeche from Port Royal, while Henry Morgan used it as a staging point for his famous attacks on Panama, Portobello, and Maracaibo. Other buccaneers, including Rocha Bertolano, John Davis, and Edward Mansfield, would call Port Royal home. As these raiders brought loot into Port Royal, the town's merchants meanwhile invented a new fun economic model called forced trade. Merchants in Port Royal would often start trading with Spanish colonies, selling them products or buying what they wanted and then seeking privateering raids against those same colonies' ships and coastal towns. Because of the privateers too, the Spanish had no choice but to accept English trade, because Spain's regular treasure fleets had become increasingly unreliable, unable to keep pace with colonial demands for manufactured goods, and unable to sail when needed due to raiders, having to wait for convoys, which meant that an English merchant could buy goods off a privateer and then sell them back to the Spanish, only for these goods to be stolen again. The money that flowed into Port Royal from privateering and piracy did not sit quietly in merchants' strongboxes or make its way back to England though. Sailors would often spend every pound and shilling they earned in the town's taverns, gambling dens and brothels, which gave rise to Port Royal's enduring reputation as the wickedest city on earth. That's a direct quote, not making that up. In some accounts too, it was actually called the Sodom of the New World. By the 1660s, the town had, in the eyes of many observers, become something like a pirate's paradise, kind of in a similar fashion as to what we see Nassau as today, except of course this was state-sanctioned by the English crown. Contemporary writers such as Charles Leslie would actually describe a place where the pirates were so drunk and so, shall we say, into the ladies of the night, that wealth meant nothing to them. So long as they could get a drink and a woman when they made port, nothing else mattered. Some sailors were so given over to their vices that we have accounts of sailors coming into port rich, and within a few days being poor and begging for food. We also know through genealogy that Blackbeard himself would briefly call Jamaica home in the early 18th century, listed as a mariner aboard a Royal Navy vessel in 1706. Just to give you an idea of how bad this town became for drinking and partying, at its height the town supported one drinking house for roughly 10 residents. In July 1661 alone, 40 new tavern licenses were issued. Over a 20-year span ending in 1692, the town's population would approach around 10,000 people packed into roughly 2,000 buildings crammed into just 51 acres of land. In 1688 alone, 213 ships would actually call at the port, and so much hard currency circulated through the town that coins were actually preferred outright over barter systems, which were commonplace in other colonies in, the Caribbean and North America. but the day of piracy was essentially over, and funnily enough it was the privateer Henry Morgan who ended it when he was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. Morgan and the other well-to-do locals largely resented the reputation the city had developed, and they sought to build a more reputable identity for the colony. However, it was the 1600s, and so that reputable identity was bought through means such as slavery and plantations. By 1687, the pivot of Jamaica from pirate haven to proper colonial city had effectively been finalised, with the passing of anti-piracy legislation which meant that Port Royal was now the location where pirates would be taken to be executed, not to party. Largely this triggered a lot of pirate crews sailing north to the Bahamas, and this is where you start to see the birth of the so-called Pirate Republic in Nassau, and also in some senses in Madagascar as well, but that's obviously a story for another day and a few decades down the line. Gallows Point would be built at Port Royal, and would become the site of numerous executions, including those of Charles Vane and John Rackham in 1720. Roughly 5 months after Rackham's execution too, the pirate Mary Read would actually die in a Jamaican prison in Spanish Town. 2 years after that, 41 pirates would be executed within a single month. Things had changed, and piracy waned, and as this occurred, the Royal Navy would step into the vacuum, using a careening wharf at Port Royal and renting a building on the shore as a storehouse. Starting in 1675, a resident naval officer was actually appointed to manage these facilities, but the end was coming for Port Royal, and it would not be with a whimper but with a bang, and in 1700, just 20 years after its height, Port Royal would be a shadow of its former self. On the 7th of June 1692 at 11:43am, the end would come for Port Royal when a powerful earthquake tore through the town, and the ground beneath much of its northern section simply gave way, taking houses, warehouses, and much of the built environment down with it. The town's defensive forts would be simply swallowed by the earth, with only Fort Charles managing to survive. Fort James and Fort Carlisle sank entirely into the sea, Fort Rupert was reduced to open water, and the area known as Morgan's Line suffered extensive damage. Although the earthquake struck the whole of Jamaica, Port Royal suffered the most, with the town being quite literally eaten alive by the earth as stone buildings were consumed by the bay, which in a few hours was littered with the bodies of locals who were ashore at the time, washed away by the following tsunami. The earthquake destroyed any kind of medical and logistical support that people could hope to receive too. The town was simply ruined. Estimates suggest the initial earthquake and tsunami alone killed between 1,000 and 3,000 people. And keep in mind the population of the town was around 10,000 at most, but likely around 6,500 at this time. And the days and weeks that followed, a further 1,000 to 2,000 would also die from fever and sickness, and in just a month this growing city was gone, reduced to rubble and a collection of terrified locals in tents finding shelter in the ruins and on the other side of the harbour, in what can be described as a sort of tent city. For the people who lived in the city at the time, it truly must have been horrifying, and many in these days would turn to religion to try and make sense of how in the blink of an eye a whole city was gone. Of course, modern geological and archaeological research has clarified what actually happened beneath Port Royal streets that day. The town sat atop water-saturated sand, with a water table just 2 feet or around half a metre below the surface. The town itself was largely made from stone, such as, for example, the defensive forts and well. Putting forts on waterlogged sand is not the best idea. Scientists and underwater archaeologists now largely agree that the earthquake triggered a process called soil liquefaction, in which the violent shaking caused loose saturated ground to behave like a dense fluid rather than a solid. Water pressure would build within the soil, or sand, forcing particles apart and turning the ground into something closer to quicksand than solid earth. Eyewitness accounts at the time described buildings appearing to slide directly into the water, although many structures themselves just sank when they stood straight downwards, as the ground beneath them liquefied, in which, horrifyingly, this would lead to the drowning of people in their homes without warning. Underwater archaeological surveys have revealed that building foundations still stand on the sea floor, almost as if they just sort of fell straight down underwater. Like Pompeii and pyroclastic flows, the city was just essentially swallowed by the earth. Efforts to rebuild Port Royal would begin almost immediately, focusing on roughly 1/3 of the town that had not been submerged, but the results were mixed and setbacks just kept coming. An early attempt at reconstruction was undone by a fire in 1703, and through the first half of the 18th century, a series of hurricanes further hampered recovery, including a storm surge in 1722 and major hurricanes in 1774. not to mention the issues of fire and just a lack of housing. Essentially, every single time the town began to grow again, something would happen to break everything all over again. But those people who had fled the town to seek shelter on the other side of the bay in 1692, they hadn't just sat idle, they had been building a new home called Kingston. And Kingston, thanks to geography, was a stronger foundation and it had more land for expansion while also having access to the large natural harbour. As time passed, the city of Kingston would grow to dominate the island politically and economically, eventually, as previously mentioned, becoming the capital of Jamaica, which is what it remains to this day. Although by the 1700s Kingston had taken over Port Royal, the Royal Navy was not finished with the region, and although initially considering Port Antonio as a naval base, by 1735 they had returned to Port Royal, and the Admiralty invested in new wharves, storehouses and officer housing. Over the following decades they expanded the site to a proper naval yard, complemented by a hospital, and also a small victualling yard to supply passing ships. It became, by the late 1700s, the premier naval base of the premier colony of the British Empire in North America, with the Royal Navy fighting the Battle of the Saints in defence of Jamaica in 1782, choosing to focus on defending the Caribbean and its wealth over continuing the war in the North American colonies. By the 19th century, Port Royal hosted a substantial Royal Navy dockyard supporting Britain's Caribbean fleet, anchored by a large storehouse topped with a clock tower and connected to the careening wharves by a covered walkway amongst other buildings. As naval technology evolved, so too did the yard. Its victualling wharf became a coaling depot in the 1840s, and a small engineering complex followed 20 years later. Expansion continued into the early 20th century, but as Britain's naval priorities shifted towards the growing tensions in Europe, the Royal Navy withdrew from Jamaica and the dockyard would close in 1905. But the final blow to Port Royal, it would come though on the 14th of January 1907, when another earthquake once again liquefied the sand beneath the town, destroying nearly all of the rebuilding that had taken place since 1692 and submerging further sections of the town, and actually tilting a small artillery storage building known as the Giddy House, which you can actually still see today, and it's become somewhat of a tourist attraction. By the 20th century, Port Royal had become a fraction of its former self, a town fewer than 2,000 residents with the remaining commercial or political significance drawing tourists but showing a lot of neglect. Plans dating back to the 1960s to develop the town into a cruise ship port were eventually abandoned, but they did trigger some archaeological exploration for the first time at the site, and that has revealed a treasure trove of preserved buildings and items in a way that can only be described as a pirate Pompeii. For example, we know the exact time of the 1692 earthquake because we found a pocket watch that had stopped right when it happened, buried inside a building that had been sunk and swallowed by the earth. Serious underwater archaeological studies at Port Royal would then begin in 1981, when the Natural Archaeology program at Texas A&M University launched a decade-long investigation of the portions of the town that had sunk beneath the harbour in 1692. The team focused on an area that had been swallowed directly into the sea largely intact rather than being scattered or destroyed by the shaking. Because of the site's low oxygen levels and the density of the sand, many things had actually been preserved, including a lot of organic material. Quite unusually well given, it's the tropics and it's not that far from the surface. Archaeologists were able to recover an extraordinary range of artifacts, allowing them to reconstruct essentially daily life in Port Royal, in a special way that I can't really quite convey just how important it is to our knowledge of the time period. Port Royal essentially became a mini time capsule in the space of one seemingly random morning of 1692. The world isn't quite done with Port Royal either, because in 1998 the Port Royal Development Company commissioned the architectural firm the Jerd Partnership to draw up a master plan for redeveloping the township, and this plan was finally completed in 2000. The vision is essentially centered on the 17th century themed older buildings and building them into a tourist attraction around that area, the Old Port Royal, and the King's Royal Naval Dockyard. Old Port Royal was envisioned with a cruise ship pier extending out from a reconstructed version of the historic harbour, along Fisher's Row, and a collection of waterfront cafes and shops, ideally built to withstand earthquakes. The King's Royal Naval Dockyard was also going to be built into a shipbuilding museum, with an underwater aquarium featuring dioramas of native tropical marine life, and the plan also calls for turning the headquarters of the Royal Navy's buildings in the area into a 5-star hotel. These plans are moving very slowly. Jamaica is not a country that is incredibly wealthy, and by 2019, a floating pier capable of accommodating cruise ships had actually finally been completed, and the first ship docked there on the 20th of January 2020, but the pandemic did set things back pretty badly, and it's only been recently in 2025 that Jamaica was able to get the region designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These days, if you are able to visit, you can still see Fort Charles and get a small tour. Now, there is quite a good museum there, but if you were a diver, that's when Port Royal comes alive because there is still so much to explore under the ocean. It is, in every sense of the word, a treasure trove, a pirate Pompeii. Today, it's essentially just a small town with some tourist structures going through a redevelopment. But for the longest time ever, it was the premier port if you were a pirate. It was the big defensive structure on Jamaica. Port Royal is quite special, and it's quite important to the development of European empires in the New World, along with piracy and also just in general, the existence of the country of Jamaica. The Port Royal of Pirates of the Caribbean, though, it didn't exist. The fort was never that big. It's a lot smaller. If the fort was as big as it was in Pirates of the Caribbean, can you imagine how bad the earthquake would be? If you do want a semi-faithful reconstruction, by all means play Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced and just go run around it a bit. It's not perfectly accurate, but you get an idea of just how devastating the earthquakes were, and you get an idea of what a fort in that era would have actually looked like in Jamaica, and specifically in Port Royal, but just keep in mind it's scaled down massively, and the real Port Royal was far, far bigger. This very much is, though, a case of where history is far more interesting than fiction. And, one day I do hope to actually go and see it with my own eyes, and touch wood, it doesn't get hit by another earthquake and we don't lose anything more, let alone any more lives. I hope you all enjoyed this little trip to Port Royal, and as always, remember, when privateering on the Spanish Main, do not spend all your money on the first day back to port. She does not love you, and no, you don't need an entire cask of wine to yourself. In short, choose the lesser of two evils.